The man who called himself Marshal Owen Doyle pressed the cold barrel of his revolver against the side of Beatrice Brenner's neck, and her blood turned to ice water. "You are going to step back inside that house," he said, his voice smooth and unhurried, the kind of voice a man uses when he knows he has already won. "You are going to tell your father to sign those deed papers. And you are going to do it right now, or I am going to have a very long conversation with the territorial judge about the rustling charges I've been building against the Brenner Ranch." Beatrice did not flinch. She did not cry. She looked at the silver star on his chest, the one she had watched get pinned there just 3 days ago in the Caldwell town square, and she felt something cold and clarifying settle into her chest like a stone dropping into still water, because she knew something that nobody else in Caldwell, Kansas knew. She knew something that this man, whoever he truly was, had gambled everything on nobody knowing. She had met the real Owen Doyle, and this was not him. She had met Owen Doyle 6 weeks ago on the Chisholm Trail, 12 miles south of where they were standing now. She had been tracking a stolen quarter horse through 3 days of rain and broken terrain, and she had come upon a camp where a lean, dark-haired man with a jaw like carved flint was sitting across a small fire from a Comanche trader, negotiating in what sounded to her ear like passable Comanche. Owen Doyle had a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his jaw, a thin white line like a seam in weathered leather. He had a way of going completely still when he was thinking, like a predator assessing distance. His hands were calloused in a specific way from years of rope work. His right thumb was crooked at the first knuckle from an old break. The man pressing a gun to her neck had none of those things. His hands were too soft, his left eye twitched when he lied, and there was no scar, not so much as a shadow of one. "I am going to count to 3, the imposter said. Beatrice turned her head very slowly and looked him directly in the eyes. "You are not Owen Doyle," she said. "And when the real one gets here, you are going to deeply regret every single choice that brought you to this porch." 6 weeks earlier, the trouble began the way most trouble in the Kansas Territory began in the summer of 1874. It began with land, and the men who wanted it badly enough to bleed for it. The Brenner Ranch sat on 1,100 acres of prime grass between Caldwell and the Oklahoma border, a stretch of territory that the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad had quietly identified as an essential right-of-way corridor for the expansion of their southern line. The grass was sweet and deep. The creek that cut through the eastern quarter never ran dry, and the Brenner family had held that land for nearly 20 years, since Beatrice's father Hector Brenner had driven a stake into the ground and built a single-room sod house with his bare hands the year after the war ended. Hector was 61 now, weather-carved and barrel-chested, with arthritic hands that still gripped a fence post like they could bend iron. He had 3 things he loved without reservation in the world: the land, his daughter Beatrice, and the horses she had turned into the finest breeding operation south of Wichita. Beatrice Brenner was 26 years old, and she was what the territory called a horsewoman, though that word did not come close to capturing what she actually was. She had spent the better part of her life studying the movement, psychology, and bloodlines of horses with the same systematic rigor that an Eastern University professor applied to ancient manuscripts. She could look at a horse's cannon bones and predict its speed ceiling. She could assess temperament from the set of a horse's ears and the width between its eyes. She had developed a system of natural training that the Comanche traders she occasionally worked with had respected enough to call her by a title in their own language that, when translated, meant roughly, the one who speaks without speaking. She could track a horse across 3 days of rain-soaked Kansas hardpan and find it in the dark. She had demonstrated that skill the day she first encountered Owen Doyle. It had been late August, the kind of afternoon where the sky turned the color of a bruise and the air felt thick enough to push your hands through. Beatrice had been tracking one of her father's stolen quarter horses, a 3-year-old roan stallion named Redfair, whose breeding represented nearly 2 years of careful bloodline work. The tracks had led her south, off the main trail, into a broken stretch of cedar and limestone draws. She had come over a ridge on her own bay mare, Compass, and pulled up short at the sight of a camp below. There were two men at the fire. One was a Comanche trader she recognized by his blanket and the distinctive pattern of beads at his belt. The other was a man she did not recognize, lean and dark-haired, sitting, cross-legged with the relaxed wariness of someone who spent most of his time in open country. He was speaking to the trader in low, unhurried tones, and the language was Comanche, or near enough to it that she had to listen hard to be certain. She was deciding whether to circle wide when her mare shifted, and the dark-haired man looked up with a speed that was not alarmed but was absolutely precise, like a compass needle finding north. "You can come down," he said in English now, switching without effort. "I can see you are tracking something, and Quanah here tells me there was a roan horse that came through this draw about 2 hours ahead of you." Beatrice considered him for a moment, then picked her way down the slope. She read him as she rode, the way she read horses, the stillness, the scar on his jaw, the way his right hand rested near his hip out of pure habit and not out of any intention to draw, the Marshal's badge on his coat, partially visible as his lapel shifted with the wind. "Beatrice Brenner," she said, dismounting. "That roan is mine." "Owen Doyle," he said, and he did not look surprised that she had stated her own name first before asking for his. "Federal Marshal out of Dodge City. The horse is tied behind those cedars. 2 men who were moving it got spooked when Quanah and I came down the draw and they ran south." He paused. "I can ride after them with you if you want a witness when you recover it, or I can let you handle your own business." She looked at him. He looked at her. "I will handle my own business," she said, "but I appreciate the offer." He nodded once, a small acknowledgement that carried no diminishment in it, no surprise that a woman alone in the broken country had any intention of riding after horse thieves without male escort. She had been around enough men to know that the absence of condescension was rarer than it should have been. She recovered Redfire that evening, in a dry creek bed 4 miles south, where the 2 thieves had gotten their wagon wheel stuck in a limestone crack and were still arguing about how to free it when she arrived. She did not need to draw her own revolver. She simply set Compass sideways across the trail, looked at both men with that particular quality of absolute certainty that she had developed over years of handling 1,000-pound animals that could kill you if they sensed fear, and said in a completely level voice, "Unhitch that horse and go south. I will not ask twice." They unhitched the horse and went south. She told her father about the federal marshal she had met on the trail, the one named Owen Doyle with the scar and the broken thumb and the working knowledge of Comanche. Hector had listened, filed the information away in the careful mental ledger he kept of useful and trustworthy people in the territory, and gone back to his fence line. 3 weeks later, the railroad pressure began. It came first through a lawyer named Kavanaugh who arrived from Wichita with a briefcase and a suit that cost more than most men in Caldwell earned in a year. He sat at the Brenner kitchen table and presented Hector with a number. Hector told him the number was insultingly small and showed him the door. Kavanaugh went away and came back 2 weeks later with a larger number. Hector showed him the door again. Then the harassment started. Fence lines cut in the night, a water trough poisoned, killing 2 of Beatrice's young horses before she identified the contamination and pulled the others away from it. Those deaths hit her like a physical blow, a raw, devastating grief that she had to set aside and seal behind her jaw because there was work to be done. She loved those animals with the specific depth of someone who has spent years learning to understand another creature's language and trust. Losing them felt like losing something irreplaceable, and the cold anger that settled in behind that grief was the kind that did not burn out quickly. Then the rustling charges appeared. They were fabricated. She knew that immediately. The specifics were too clean, too convenient, signed off by a county official she had never trusted and laid before the territorial court, with the kind of organized efficiency that suggested someone had been building the paperwork for weeks. The charges alleged that the Brenner Ranch had been systematically stealing cattle from 3 neighboring operations over the past year. Hector, who had not stolen so much as a wooden match in his 61 years of life, stared at the papers with the bewildered anger of a man who has just been told the sky is green. "We need a federal marshal," Beatrice said. Hector looked at her. "You said you met one." "I said I met Owen Doyle, federal marshal out of Dodge City." She rode to Dodge City herself because she trusted no telegraph operator in the county not to sell information to the highest bidder. The round trip took 3 days on horseback, changing horses at way stations along the Chisholm Trail. At the federal office in Dodge City, she filed a formal request for an investigation into the fraudulent charges and asked specifically for Owen Doyle, citing her prior encounter and his demonstrated familiarity with the territory. The duty officer recorded her request, told her that Marshal Doyle was currently in the field on a separate matter, but that the request would be forwarded, and that a marshal would be dispatched to Caldwell within the week. She rode home. 4 days later, a man arrived in Caldwell and introduced himself as Marshal Owen Doyle. He had dark hair. He had a badge. He had papers that looked entirely correct, signed and sealed and official, bearing the name Owen Doyle and the seal of the federal marshal's office in Dodge City. He had a confident, authoritative manner that immediately won over both the town council and her father. He pinned his badge on in the Caldwell town square, shook hands with the mayor, and told the assembled crowd that he was there to ensure justice was done and the rule of law upheld. Beatrice watched from the edge of the square and felt that stone drop into her chest. No scar, both thumbs straight, hands too soft for a man who worked horses and rope. And when he spoke to her directly for the first time and smiled with that smooth, practiced confidence, his left eye had performed a single, almost imperceptible twitch. She said nothing. Not yet. She needed to be certain. She needed to understand what she was looking at, what the dark purpose behind it was, and she needed to know where the real Owen Doyle was before she acted. She began watching the imposter the way she watched a new horse in the paddock. Patient. Precise. Cataloging every habit, every tell, every moment of inconsistency between the performance and the man underneath it. His name, she would learn later, was Clement Voss. He was 32 years old, a former Pinkerton detective who had been dismissed 2 years ago for evidence tampering and extortion. He had a gift for documents and a gift for performance, and he had apparently spent considerable time studying Owen Doyle's history, reputation, and manner well enough to pass among people who had never met the man. He had been hired by the railroad, she would eventually confirm, through a third party with enough insulation to protect the railroad's hands. His job was to come in as the law, validate the fabricated rustling charges against the Brenner Ranch, condemn the operation, and give the railroad the legal cover to seize the land through the courts. It was a trap laid with the kind of cold, meticulous patience that required significant resources and complete indifference to the lives being destroyed. In the 4 days before he came to the porch with his gun, Voss moved through Caldwell like a man who owned the place. He reviewed the rustling charges with evident satisfaction, made a show of interviewing witnesses, and subtly reinforced the narrative against the Brenner Ranch at every saloon table and dry goods store conversation he could engineer. By the end of the 3rd day, Beatrice could feel the town's opinion shifting the way she could feel a horse beginning to spook, a subtle change in weight distribution, a gathering tension. She was not idle during those 4 days. She wrote a second letter to the federal marshal's office in Dodge City, this one coded inside a livestock purchase inquiry that she trusted would not draw attention. She sent it with a trail rider named Cobb Ferris, a young man who worked occasionally for the Brenner Ranch and who she knew to be honest and fast. She gave him specific instructions about where to deliver it and what to say. She also began laying the groundwork for what she suspected would need to happen when the trap closed, because She had no illusion that Voss was going to simply accept her quiet observation. A man running this kind of operation did not leave loose ends, and she had been watching him too openly for him not to have noticed. On the morning of the fourth day, she found a message slipped under the door of the horse barn. It said simply, "Stop asking questions. Last warning." She burned it in the lamp and went back to work. That afternoon, she finished what she had been quietly building for 3 days. In the hiding place beneath the floorboards of the horse barn, she had assembled a collection of evidence: the original Brenner land deed and water rights documentation, dated and witnessed 20 years ago. Copies of the railroad's purchase offers, which she had taken from her father's desk. The forged rustling charge documents, which she had compared against authentic county paperwork, and annotated with 6 specific discrepancies that even a non-expert could follow. A written account of her encounter with the real Owen Doyle on the trail, including the physical details that distinguished him from Voss. And a sealed letter addressed to the Federal Circuit Court in Topeka, ready to be sent by the first trustworthy rider who came through. She also cleaned and loaded her own revolver, a .44 caliber Colt single-action Army, which had been her father's gift to her on her 21st birthday and which she could shoot with considerably better accuracy than most men in the county. She was finishing that last task when Voss came to the porch. He came at dusk, which was calculated. The light was bad for reading expressions, and the household was likely to be at supper. He had 2 men with him, positioned at the corners of the porch in a way that was meant to look casual and was absolutely not. Beatrice had been in the barn when she heard the boots on the steps, and she came around the corner of the house quietly, reading the configuration in a single glance. She did not go inside. She stood at the edge of the porch and looked at Voss. "Miss Brenner," he said pleasantly, "I need to discuss the status of the investigation with your father." "My father is eating supper," she said. "Whatever you need to discuss with him, you can discuss with me." Something shifted behind Voss's eyes. He had expected her to go inside to call her father to give him a moment to reconfigure the room. She had not done that. He stepped toward her. She did not step back. And then the gun was at her neck, and his voice was in her ear, smooth and unhurried, telling her to step inside and have her father sign the deed papers. "I am going to count to 3, he said. "You are not Owen Doyle," she said. "And when the real one gets here, you are going to deeply regret every single choice that brought you to this porch." The count was interrupted by the sound of a horse arriving at a hard gallop. A single rider came through the gate at the kind of speed that meant either desperate urgency or significant confidence in the horse under him, and both of those things made the night's geometry shift. One of Voss's men at the corner of the porch took 2 steps toward the gate and then stopped, because the rider pulled up short in the last of the evening light, and the thing he was presenting to the night air was a badge, a federal marshal's badge. "The name," said the rider, his voice carrying across the yard with the flat, iron quality of a man who has been shouting over wind and distance for years, "is Owen Doyle. And I have been riding for 14 hours straight to get here, which means I am not in a mood to negotiate with anyone." He dismounted, and he was exactly what she remembered: the lean, dark frame, the jaw, the scar running white and thin from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, his right thumb crooked at the first knuckle, hands that were calloused in the specific pattern of years of rope work. He looked at Voss. He looked at the gun. He looked at Beatrice with those still, assessing eyes. "Miss Brenner," he said, with a measured calm that she recognized from the cedars and the fire and the trading conversation in passable Comanche. "Are you all right?" "I am perfectly fine," she said. "I have been waiting for you." What happened in the next 60 seconds was both fast and very clear. Owen Doyle had not ridden 14 hours to negotiate. The 2 men at the corners of the porch made the collective mistake of looking at each other instead of at him during the moment of reconfiguration. And in that window, he crossed the yard with a speed that was entirely at odds with his unhurried tone. He caught Voss's gun hand at the wrist, twisted with a leverage that was mechanically efficient and anatomically persuasive, and had the man's arm at an angle that prevented both shooting and running before Voss had completed the processing of what was happening. Beatrice stepped away from the gun, stepped back, and drew her own revolver with a smooth, practiced motion that covered the two men at the corners before either of them had decided to be useful. "Do not," she said, in the same level, absolute voice she had used on the horse thieves in the dry creek bed. They did not. Owen Doyle looked at her over Voss's shoulder, and for just a moment that complete stillness in him broke into something different, something that was not quite professional assessment. His eyes moved from her gun to her face to the way she was standing, and he registered something that Beatrice had seen very few men register when they looked at her. He was genuinely impressed. "I see you have handled your own business again," he said. "Mostly," she said. "I am glad you arrived for the last part." Hector Brenner burst out of the front door with his own rifle at the commotion, assessed the situation with the speed of a man who had survived 20 years of frontier life, and proceeded to cover the two corner men while Owen Doyle secured Voss with a pair of iron manacles that he had apparently carried specifically for this occasion. Cobb Ferris, the young rider who had taken Beatrice's coded letter to Dodge City, appeared at the gate 2 minutes later, slightly behind Owen Doyle and breathing hard on a considerably less impressive horse. "I told the Marshal's office what she said," Cobb reported, to no one in particular, with the satisfied exhaustion of a man who has completed a difficult errand. "He left before me, but I told them and they are sending more." Owen Doyle sat Voss down on the porch steps, checked the manacles, and then straightened and looked at Beatrice with that measuring quality that she was beginning to identify as his default mode of engagement with things he found worth understanding. "Your letter to Dodge City said the Marshal who arrived in Caldwell was an imposter," he said. "What made you certain?" She told him, all of it. The specific physical details she had catalogued on the trail 6 weeks ago, the absence of those details in Voss's presentation, the soft hands and the straight thumbs and the absence of the scar, the eye twitch, the way Voss's voice had a theatrical quality where Owen Doyle's was simply direct. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment in that particular way of his. "Most trained lawmen would not have caught that," he said. "I track for a living," she said. "The principles are the same." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression was entirely unguarded for just that interval, a kind of open, honest recognition that she had not expected from a man she had only spent a few hours in the proximity of. "Yes," he said. "I imagine they are." The cleanup took 3 days, which was 3 days of Owen Doyle working from a spare room at the Brenner Ranch, because there was no reasonable alternative lodging in Caldwell that was not infected with Voss's influence. In those 3 days, Beatrice learned things about Owen Doyle that she had not learned in their first brief encounter. She learned that he was 31 years old, that he had grown up in Missouri and come west at 17 after his family's farm failed in the drought of 1860, that he had been a trail hand and then a scout, and then a deputy before being appointed a federal marshal at 27. She learned that he spoke a working knowledge of 3 languages apart from English, Spanish and Comanche, and a smattering of Kiowa. She learned that he was methodical and precise, and carried an organizational exactness in his work that was nearly fastidious, which she had not expected from someone whose exterior was so definitively frontier-worn. She also learned that he had been tracking Clement Voss, not because of this particular scheme, but because of 3 prior incidents in Kansas and Indian Territory, where Voss had run similar operations, impersonating law officials for hire to facilitate land seizures. He had a dark past that made the air around him feel heavy when Owen laid out the details, a man who had been given authority and had used it systematically to destroy people who had no power to fight back. The real Owen Doyle had been following Voss for 4 months. When Beatrice's first letter arrived at the Dodge City Marshal's office, he had still been 2 days' ride south in Indian Territory. The duty officer who received her request had sent a routine dispatch rider, not knowing that the Dodge City office had been temporarily compromised by a contact of Voss's who had altered the routing of correspondence. The dispatch rider had been misdirected. Owen Doyle had received Beatrice's second letter, the coded livestock inquiry that Cobb Ferris had delivered directly to his last known camp position rather than through the office, and he had ridden without stopping. 14 hours, Beatrice said, on the evening of the second day. They were sitting on the porch with coffee, the last light going amber over the grass, and she was thinking about the details of that ride. That is roughly 50 miles at the pace you would have had to keep. Closer to 55, he said. That is hard on a horse. He is a good horse, she looked at him. What kind? He almost smiled. Quarter horse, 3-year-old roan. She sat up straighter. That is not a coincidence. No, he said. When I came back through that draw after your initial encounter, I followed up on the men who had taken your horse. The one they had used as a spare mount was left behind when they ran. I could not identify an owner. I was not going to leave a horse of that quality for anyone to pick up. Beatrice stared at him. You have been riding Redfire for 6 weeks. If that is his name, then yes. She stood up, which was partly because she needed to move and partly because the thing she was feeling was complicated enough that she needed a moment to organize it. She walked to the porch rail and looked out at the darkening grass and the first stars appearing over the southern horizon. I bred that horse, she said. I spent 2 years on those bloodlines. I know every habit he has. He leads left, Owen Doyle said. He has a head-shy moment about a minute into a gallop that resolves on its own if you give him the rein. He will take water from a hat but not from a bucket. She turned around and looked at him. The thing about Owen Doyle, she was discovering, was that he paid attention. Not the performing kind of attention that men sometimes deployed in the presence of women they were trying to impress, the exaggerated interest, the nodding at slightly wrong intervals. Actual attention. The kind that absorbed specific details and held them and connected them to other details in a way that created real understanding. It was the same quality she looked for in a good horse handler. The ability to genuinely receive information rather than just wait for a turn to speak. You did not have to ride through the night, she said. You were in danger, he said simply. I had the situation largely contained. You did, he said. That was evident. I would have liked to have been less late regardless. There was a pause in which the crickets started up and the last light went from amber to gray to the deep blue of true dusk. Come and look at him with me, she said. Redfire tomorrow morning. I want to see how you handle him. It was not, she reflected later, the most transparent invitation she had ever issued. It was entirely practical. She was a horse breeder, and he had been riding one of her best animals for 6 weeks. There were valid professional reasons to observe the relationship between horse and handler. She was also, she acknowledged privately, curious about him in a way that had nothing to do with horses and everything to do with the way he had crossed that yard in the dark with absolute precision, and the way he looked at her without the particular quality of unsettlement that most men seem to experience in the presence of a woman who was clearly more capable than they had expected. She did not examine that curiosity too closely. Not yet. There was still work to be done. The third day brought the additional marshals that Cobb Ferris had alerted, 2 deputies from the Dodge City office who took custody of Clement Voss and his 2 associates, and began the process of collecting the evidence Beatrice had assembled under the horse barn floorboards. She walked them through every document, every annotation, every discrepancy she had identified in the forged rustling charges, with the methodical clarity of someone who had organized their evidence specifically for this purpose. Owen Doyle watched her do it. He stood at the edge of the tack room where she had spread the documents on a work table, and he watched her take 2 federal deputies through 6 pages of annotated evidence with a precision and organization that would have impressed a lawyer, and his expression held that particular quality of open recognition that she was beginning to associate with him specifically. After the deputies left with the evidence, he said, "Where did you learn to build a case like that?" "My mother," she said. She was a school teacher. She taught me that the most powerful thing a person can do in any dispute is to be the one in the room who actually knows what they are talking about. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was, Beatrice said. She died 8 years ago, fever. A silence, the kind that holds genuine sympathy rather than performing it. I am sorry, he said. She nodded, accepting it. Later that morning she took him to the paddock where Redfire had been resting since his long midnight run, and she watched Owen Doyle approach the horse. She noted the angle of his approach, the position of his hands, the pace of his walk, the way he read the horse's ear position before he was within 10 feet and adjusted his own energy accordingly. He stopped 2 feet out and waited, letting the horse come to him on its own terms, and Redfire, who was in fact somewhat head-shy and opinionated, stretched his neck forward and pressed his nose against Owen Doyle's chest within about 30 seconds. Beatrice observed this with the professional satisfaction of someone who has just confirmed a significant positive assessment. "You have good hands," she said. Owen looked at her over Redfire's neck, one hand moving in a quiet, slow stroke along the horse's jaw. "Is that your highest compliment? For someone I have known less than a week?" "Yes," she said, provisionally. He almost smiled again. She was developing a specific interest in his almost smiles, the way they appeared and were then carefully managed back into that professional stillness, as if he kept the full version in reserve for something. On the afternoon of the third day, the railroad's lawyer Kavanaugh appeared in Caldwell and attempted to argue that the evidence Beatrice had assembled was inadmissible because it had been gathered by a civilian and not by law enforcement. Owen Doyle listened to this argument for approximately 2 minutes before informing Kavanaugh, in a tone of absolute unhurried authority, that Miss Brenner had been effectively functioning as the only competent investigator of this matter for the past week, that her documentation was going to the circuit court in Topeka, along with a full account of the railroad's involvement in the extortion scheme, and that Kavanaugh himself was welcome to explain to that court his precise role in delivering forged documents to a fraudulent Marshal. Kavanaugh left on the next northbound stage. Hector Brenner, who had been watching this exchange from the porch with his coffee, looked at his daughter with an expression that combined deep satisfaction with something more complicated. "I like that man," he said. "I know," Beatrice said. "He is staying for supper." "I know that too." Supper at the Brenner table was a different kind of thing than the formal professional interactions of the previous 3 days. Hector served the meal himself with the particular combination of rough capability and genuine hospitality that characterized everything he did, and the conversation ranged from the current state of the cattle market to the railroad's growing presence in the territory to the question of whether the Comanche trade routes were being disrupted by the recent land surveys along the Oklahoma border. Owen Doyle engaged with all of it with real intelligence and real opinions, and Hector, who had spent 20 years developing a precise and reliable instinct for who a man actually was, assessed him with satisfaction. Beatrice mostly listened, because she was reading the room in the same way she read a new horse in a new space, learning the patterns, noting the consistencies, watching for the moments when the performance surface dropped and the actual person was visible underneath. Owen Doyle had remarkably little performance surface. What she could see was almost entirely consistent with what was actually there. It was, she reflected, a rare quality. After supper, she walked with him to the barn to check Redfire, which had become a natural and apparently mutual habit over the past 2 days, and they stood in the evening quiet of the stall with the roan horse between them, and talked for 2 hours about nothing that had anything to do with marshals or imposters or railroad land grabs. They talked about horses, primarily. The specific mechanics of the Brenner breeding program, the bloodlines she was working with, the quarter horse's particular suitability for the Kansas prairie terrain. He asked intelligent questions, the kind that revealed he had been paying careful attention for 6 weeks to the horse he was riding, and she found herself explaining things with a depth and enthusiasm that she usually reserved for conversations with the Comanche traders who shared her genuine interest. They talked about the territory, the way it was changing, the pressure of the railroad's expansion on the people who had gotten there first, the question of what the next 20 years would look like for the operations that had been built on open range, and were now being hemmed in by survey lines and legal frameworks designed by men in offices far to the east. They talked about his work, the specific weight of being responsible for law in a territory where law was still largely theoretical, where the badge you wore was sometimes the only institutional presence for 100 miles in any direction. He spoke about it without self-importance and without false modesty, simply as a thing he had undertaken and intended to do well. And the dark parts of it, the moments where the system had failed and he had been unable to prevent that, he acknowledged plainly rather than packaging them into a more comfortable shape. The 2 hours ended with the barn quiet around them, and both of them leaning against opposite sides of the stall and Redfire dozing between them, with his lower lip hanging in that specific expression of complete equine contentment. And Beatrice realized that she had not been this entirely comfortable in another person's company since her mother had been alive. "You are leaving tomorrow," she said. "I have to take Voss to Dodge City," he said, "and file the case with the circuit court. It will take several weeks to get through the initial proceedings." "Of course." A silence. The sleeping horse breathed. "After the initial proceedings," he said, with the same careful precision he applied to everything, "I will need to return to Caldwell to testify at the formal hearing regarding the fraudulent charges against the Brenner Ranch. That will be required in person." She looked at him. He was looking at the horse. "That could be arranged," she said. "I thought it might be," he said. And this time the almost smile did not manage itself back. It arrived fully, and it was worth the wait. He left the following morning with Voss in manacles, and his 2 deputies flanking the wagon and Cobb Ferris, riding along out of pure enthusiasm. Beatrice watched from the porch with coffee and did not wave because she was not the waving type, but she watched until the dust of the trail settled back down and the sound of the wagon was gone, and then she went back to work. The weeks that followed had the quality of a held breath. The work of the ranch continued. Beatrice returned to her breeding program with the focused intensity that the previous month's disruptions had interrupted, and there was a satisfaction in it that had always been there, but somehow felt sharper now, as if the fight to keep the land had clarified the value of what she was building on it. She received a letter from Owen Doyle 3 weeks after he had left. It was factual in its information and precise in its language, reporting on the progress of the case against Voss, the status of the evidence she had assembled, and the expected timeline for the circuit court hearing. It was entirely professional. In the last paragraph, he mentioned that Redfire had developed a new habit of trying to reach over the post rail to steal hay from the adjacent stall, and that he had tried Beatrice's approach of giving the horse a task to redirect the behavior, and it had worked. She read that last paragraph 3 times. She wrote back. Her letter was also factual, also precise, also entirely professional until the second-to-last paragraph, where she asked whether he had noticed yet that Redfire's lead-left preference was slightly more pronounced on cold mornings, and whether that matched what she had observed, which was that the horse's left shoulder had a minor old injury that stiffened in cool weather. In the last paragraph, she mentioned that the south pasture grass had come in exceptionally this season, and that the breeding program had produced 2 foals that were exceeding early expectations. She did not examine what she was doing very closely. It was correspondence, about horses, entirely practical. His reply arrived 2 weeks later and was longer than the first letter. He confirmed the left shoulder observation with 4 additional details she had not mentioned and had clearly arrived at independently. He asked 3 specific questions about the foaling process that suggested he had been thinking about it with some care. In the last paragraph, He said that the circuit court hearing had been scheduled for the second week of October, which was 6 weeks away, and that he would be traveling through Caldwell the week before to review the final evidence with her if that was convenient. The week before was not mentioned again in the subsequent letters. He would simply arrive. She found herself planning for his arrival in ways that were partly professional and partly not, which she acknowledged, and then filed under the heading of things to examine later. She prepared the evidence files with immaculate care, reorganized the documentation, and wrote a clean summary of the physical discrepancies between Voss and the real Owen Doyle that she could present to the court with maximum clarity. She also, at her father's gentle suggestion and over her own muttered protest, had the guest room properly prepared and arranged for the kind of supper that required actual planning. "He is bringing you your horse back," Hector said, with an expression of profound innocence. "He is here on federal legal business," Beatrice said. "He is bringing you your horse back," Hector repeated. Owen Doyle arrived on a Tuesday in the first week of October, and he was riding Redfire. Beatrice was in the paddock when she heard the gate, training a young filly with a rope and a specific pattern of pressure and release that she had developed over years of work, and she turned at the sound and watched him come through the gate at a walk. The roan horse moved under him with the long, ground-eating stride that was the specific signature of his bloodline, and Owen Doyle sat him with the easy correctness of someone who had learned that horse specifically, not just the general habit of riding, but the particular conversation between this horse and this rider. She lowered the rope and walked to the paddock fence, and he dismounted, and they stood on either side of the fence and looked at each other for a moment. "The left shoulder," he said. "It is more pronounced in the mornings, but it works out by mid-morning, as you said. I started adding an extra 15 minutes of walking warm-up, and it has been better." "Good," she said. She opened the gate, and he led Redfire through, and they walked the horse together to the paddock, not touching, the horse between them like a benign third presence, and talked about the shoulder and the warm-up routine, and the way the horse had changed over the 6 weeks of the trail work in ways that were measurably positive. Then she turned Redfire loose in the paddock, and they watched him find his way to the water trough and drink, and the afternoon light was the specific gold of early October in Kansas, warm and angled and very clear, and she was aware of him standing beside her with the same quality of awareness that she brought to the fence rail at the beginning of a new horse's first day in a new space. "The case is strong," he said. "The evidence you built is the foundation of it. Kavanaugh has been subpoenaed. 2 of the railroad's senior directors are going to have significant difficulties in the hearing. And Voss, he will not be free for a very long time," Owen said. "There are 3 other injured parties in Kansas territory alone. It is going to be a thorough accounting." She nodded. Justice, she thought, had a very different texture when it was the specific human consequence of the work you had done rather than an abstract concept applied from a distance. "I want to thank you," she said, "for riding through the night." "I want to thank you," he said, "for building a case solid enough to hold up to everything Kavanaugh brought against it." She looked at him. He looked at her. "Those are not equivalent things," she said. "No," he agreed. "They are not. You did something that trained marshals with significantly more resources have not done before. You identified an imposter that had passed every institutional checkpoint, built evidence against him under active threat to yourself, and delivered a case to the federal court that requires almost no additional work to prosecute." She did not know, quite, what to do with being told that directly, without qualification or condescension or the half-compliment that folded an insult inside a positive observation. She managed it by looking back at the horse. "My mother taught me to be thorough," she said. "She taught you well," he said. They ate supper with Hector again, the 3 of them, and the conversation was easier and wider than it had been the first time, as if the 6 weeks of letters had established a familiarity that required less navigation. Hector was transparently delighted, which Beatrice managed by not looking directly at him for most of the meal. Afterward, she and Owen walked out to the barn, which had become a pattern that felt natural and did not need justification. The night was cool, the first real cool of October, and the stars were enormous in the way that Kansas stars got when the summer haze had finally lifted. They leaned on the paddock fence and watched Redfire move in the moonlight because he was a horse who sometimes walked at night, and the sound of his hooves on the grass was very quiet and very regular. "I have been thinking," Owen said, with the particular careful precision of someone who has been organizing a thought for a while, "about the territory, the way it is changing, what it is going to look like in 10 years. "Tell me," she said. He talked about the pressures that were building, the railroad, the land surveys, the increasing formalization of law in places that had been open range, and the specific precariousness of operations like the Brenner Ranch that had built something real and valuable on land that powerful interests now wanted. He talked about it with the engaged concern of someone for whom it was not an abstract policy question, but a real problem involving real people. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I have been offered a position," he said, "as the resident federal marshal for Sumner County, which includes Caldwell. It is a permanent posting rather than a circuit assignment." More infrastructure, more continuity. She was quiet. "I have not decided," he said. "What is making it difficult to decide?" she asked, although she was beginning to understand the answer, and the understanding made her chest do something complicated. He looked at her directly, with those still, honest eyes. "There are things in Caldwell that are worth staying for," he said. "I wanted to be certain I was not reading those things incorrectly before I committed to a decision of that kind." She held his gaze for a long moment. In the paddock, Redfire had stopped walking and was standing with his head up, ears forward, listening to something on the south wind. "You are not reading them incorrectly," she said. He let out a breath that was not quite a sigh and was not quite a laugh and was very specifically the sound of someone who has been carrying a held thing and has set it down. "I thought there was a reasonable chance of that," he said. "I was not certain." "I am not easy to read," she said. "No," he said. "You are not. It is one of the things I find most," he paused, choosing the word with care, "compelling." She turned to face him and he turned to face her, and the October air was cold and clear between them, and Redfire watched from the paddock with equine serenity. "I am not going to be a different person because someone is in love with me," she said. It was not a warning exactly. It was more like a condition being stated clearly, the way she stated conditions to new business partners, so there was no ambiguity later. "I am not going to stop doing work that takes me into broken country alone. I am not going to stop tracking horses or training them or managing the breeding program. I am not going to defer to someone else's opinion of a horse simply because it would be more convenient." "I know," he said. "You have to actually know," she said, "not just say that you know." "Beatrice," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name without the preceding miss, and the way he said it was very direct and very quiet and very much the actual person rather than the performance. "I spent 6 weeks on a horse you bred, using methods you described in letters, watching that horse thrive. I watched you contain an armed man and 2 accomplices with a steady hand and a specific tone of voice. I read your evidence documentation, which is better than half the case files I have seen produced by trained marshals. I am not confused about who you are or what I am signing on to understand." She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. "You can take the position in Sumner County," she said. "That would be a reasonable decision." He looked at her with the specific quality of someone trying to calibrate the distance between what was being said and what was being meant. "And the other part," he said. "That is also reasonable," she said. He closed the distance between them with the same quality of deliberate precision he brought to everything else. And when he kissed her, it was exactly as unhurried and exactly as complete as everything else about him. And Redfire in the paddock made a single low sound of no particular opinion. The circuit court hearing was held in Caldwell on the 14th of October, 1874, in a room above the hardware store that served as the county's provisional courthouse. The case against Clement Voss was laid out over 2 days of testimony, with Beatrice presenting her evidence with such clarity and completeness that the territorial judge remarked from the bench that it was among the most organized civilian documentation he had reviewed in 20 years on the circuit. Voss was convicted of impersonating a federal officer, extortion, conspiracy to commit fraud, and a catalog of related charges that the additional investigation had produced. He was sentenced to 15 years in the federal penitentiary at Leavenworth, and the judge added that the 2 other Voss associates had agreed to cooperate with the prosecution of the railroad officials who had hired him, which opened a separate proceeding that would take considerably longer. The fraudulent rustling charges against the Brenner Ranch were dismissed entirely and formally expunged. The railroad's land seizure efforts were enjoined pending the outcome of the conspiracy investigation, and the Brenner land deed was reaffirmed by the court. Hector Brenner sat in the back of that courtroom and cried, which he did quietly and without any particular self-consciousness, and then blew his nose into a bandana and announced to the row of ranchers sitting around him that he would be buying the first round at the saloon. Owen Doyle accepted the permanent posting in Sumner County and established his office in Caldwell in the last week of October. He and Beatrice had a courtship that was in keeping with both of their characters, practical on the surface and deeply felt underneath, full of long conversations in the barn and shared suppers, and an ongoing negotiation about horses that was also always about more than horses. He learned the breeding program in detail, not as a passive recipient of her expertise but as an engaged student, and within 2 months he was genuinely useful in ways that were specific rather than merely willing. He also, twice in those months, rode out with her into broken country when she was tracking animals, and discovered that she was correct about the principles being the same. She read terrain and behavioral sign with the same patient precision that he used to track men, and her conclusions were as reliable as his own, though they arrived through different routes. The second time they tracked together, he told her that she could have been a marshal, and she told him that she had better things to do, and they both understood that as true without any diminishment in either direction. In December, he asked her to marry him. He did it in the barn with Redfern watching, which felt like the correct location for an occasion that had taken its first shape 6 weeks out on a trail. He did it without a prepared speech, which she respected. He said that he wanted to be her partner in the full meaning of the word, which meant the work and the land and the horses and the weight of things as well as the good parts. He said that he had been watching her handle a world that consistently underestimated her, with a grace and capability that he intended to admire for the rest of his life if she would permit it. Beatrice said yes. She said it in the same direct, unhurried way she said everything else, without a performance of surprise, because she had known it was coming and she had known her answer, and she thought the courtesy of honesty about both of those things was more respectful than a performed uncertainty. Then she said, "You should know that I intend to keep the Brenner name professionally, for the breeding program and the business. Beatrice Brenner Doyle is who I am." "Of course," he said. "I would not have expected otherwise." She kissed him for the second time, and this time Redfire did not bother to make any sound at all, being accustomed by now to the general situation. They were married in February of 1875, in a small ceremony at the Caldwell Presbyterian Church, with Hector Brenner giving her away and Cobb Ferris serving as Owen's best man on the grounds that he had, in his own words, ridden the hardest leg of this whole story, and deserved the recognition. The Comanche trader whom Beatrice knew, whose name was Akaquop, attended the ceremony from a respectful distance outside the church, and brought as a gift a particularly fine bridle worked in the traditional style that Beatrice valued as one of the finest things she owned. Owen had greeted him in the trader's own language well enough to receive a dignified nod that meant approximately adequate. The spring of 1875 was the best season the Brenner Ranch had experienced in years. The grass came in deep and sweet, the The breeding program produced 4 healthy foals whose bloodlines Beatrice had been building toward for 3 years, and Owen Doyle's presence as the resident federal marshal gave the county a stability that it had not had under the rotating circuit system. He was fair and he was thorough, and he was not for sale, which in Caldwell in 1875 was a combination worth considerably more than the wage the federal government paid for it. He also discovered, that spring, that Beatrice had been right about everything she had told him in her first letter from Dodge City regarding the railroad's corridor plans. The conspiracy investigation that had opened in the fall had produced enough documentation to demonstrate that the railroad had targeted at least 6 ranching operations along the corridor, and the Brenner Ranch had been one of 3 that had actively resisted. The other 2 had been successfully pressured into selling at depressed prices, and the federal investigation was building toward a restitution case that might partially address that injustice, though the 2 families who had sold and moved on could not be entirely made whole by any legal proceeding. Beatrice testified in those proceedings as well, contributing her organized documentation with the same precise thoroughness she had brought to everything. Owen, watching her take the stand, felt the same particular quality of admiration and pride that he had felt watching her present evidence in October, the emotion of a man who is in love with someone he also genuinely respects. They argued sometimes, not often but real arguments, over things that mattered. The primary recurring tension was over risk and its acceptable level, because Owen's professional instinct was to assess threats and plan responses, and Beatrice's instinct was to be in motion when something was happening rather than waiting for the situation to come to a planned resolution. She was not reckless, but she was not cautious, and he was not controlling, but he was not indifferent to her safety, and the negotiation of those 2 honest qualities required real conversation and genuine compromise from both of them. They got good at it. The arguments were honest, and the resolutions were real, and neither of them kept score. In the autumn of 1875, Beatrice told Owen that she was expecting a child. She told him in the barn, because the barn was where they had the most important conversations, and she told him with her characteristic directness and without drama. He went very still in the way he did when he was absorbing something significant, and then something happened in his face that she had not seen before, a complete and unguarded openness, as if a door she had not known was closed had come open all at once. He put his hands on either side of her face and looked at her for a long moment, very carefully, the way he looked at things he wanted to fully understand and not miss any part of. "Are you well?" he asked. "Entirely," she said. He kissed her forehead and then both her hands, and then she told him to stop being sentimental, and he said he was not stopping for at least another few minutes, and Redfair turned in his stall and looked at both of them with the expression of a horse that has seen enough of human emotion to have developed a philosophical acceptance of it. Their son was born in the spring of 1876. They named him Hector Owen Doyle, for the grandfather who had built the ranch with his hands and the father who had ridden through the night, and Hector Sr., upon being informed of this, sat down in his kitchen chair and was quiet for a long moment, and then said that it was a fine name, and that supper was going to be something worth eating tonight. Young Hector was a strong, opinionated infant who had his mother's quality of absolute certainty in his own requirements, and his father's quality of going completely still when something had captured his attention, and both his parents found him endlessly interesting and said so, which was probably not good for his eventual character development, but felt entirely justified in the first year. The breeding program in those years developed a reputation that extended beyond Sumner County. Beatrice Brenner Doyle's quarter horses were sought by ranch operations across Kansas and increasingly south into the Oklahoma Territory, and the specific reputation of her bloodlines for soundness and temperament meant that she could set prices rather than accept them. She traveled twice a year to negotiate sales and assess prospects, sometimes with Owen and sometimes alone, and both arrangements worked because the trust between them was not conditional on surveillance. Owen's work as the resident marshal built into something that genuinely served the county in ways that the circuit system had not. He was not the only law in Sumner County, which had a growing population and increasing commerce, but he was the anchor of it, and his familiarity with the territory, the people, and the specific pressure points of land and commerce, and the railroad's ongoing expansion, made him consistently effective. He dealt with the railroad's continued maneuvering through legal channels, with the patience and documentation-based thoroughness that he had learned, in significant part, from watching Beatrice work. In 1878, they had a second child, a daughter named Clara Me Doyle, after Beatrice's mother whose name had been Clara. Clara came into the world with exactly the same opinionated certainty as her brother, and an additional quantity of pure stubbornness that seemed to have arrived from somewhere further back in the combined family history than anyone could immediately identify. Young Hector, who was by this point 2 years old and extremely interested in horses, responded to his new sister by attempting to show her a horse immediately, which was impractical for a number of obvious reasons, but indicated a fundamentally generous character. The ranch grew. The breeding program grew. Owen's position grew in scope as Sumner County was formally organized, and the county seat was properly established at Caldwell. He was appointed by the county commission as the chief law officer of the county in 1879, a position that carried more formal weight than the federal circuit posting and more institutional support, and he accepted it after a conversation with Beatrice that covered the practical implications from 3 different angles, and ended with her telling him it was the right decision and him believing her because she was consistently right about assessments of this kind. Hector Brenner Sr. in the same year formally transferred the deed of the ranch to Beatrice, a legal and emotional event that Beatrice had not entirely anticipated, and which left her sitting at the kitchen table with the deed in her hands for a long time after her father went to bed. "He always intended it for you," Owen said, sitting across the table with coffee. "I know," she said. "I have always known that." It is still, she paused, the document in her hands, thinking about 20 years of her father's life invested in this land, and all the mornings and seasons and hard years and good years that the deed represented. It is still a significant thing to hold. "Yes," he said. He did not say anything more than that because he understood when something did not require comment and when presence was the thing. She looked up at him. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her with those quiet, honest eyes. "For what?" "For knowing when not to speak," she said. He smiled, the full one which she still, after 4 years of marriage, found entirely worth having. In 1880, Clement Voss died in the federal penitentiary at Leavenworth of a fever, which was a small, quiet conclusion to a dark past that had hurt many people. The news reached Owen through official channels, and he told Beatrice at supper, and they were both quiet for a moment, not in grief but in the particular weight of finality. "The railroad men?" Beatrice asked. "2 are still in litigation," Owen said. "One agreed to a settlement with the 2 families who were pressured out. It was not enough, but it was something." "It is never enough," she said. "No," he agreed. "But something is better than nothing for people who have been waiting 6 years for any acknowledgement." She thought about those 2 families, the ranchers who had not had the resources or the specific combination of luck and capability that the Brenner operation had possessed when the pressure came down. The injustice of that was something she could not resolve, only acknowledge, and she had acknowledged it in her testimony, and in the letters she had written to the circuit court, and in the quiet, persistent way she looked for opportunities to be useful to the broader community rather than only to her own operation. She had, over the year, become an informal resource for smaller ranch operations in the county that were facing land pressure from various corporate interests. She understood the documentation and the legal pressure points better than most lawyers in the county, and she gave that understanding freely to people who needed it, which was not uncomplicated work, and sometimes brought her into conflict with interests that would have preferred her to stay quiet. Owen, when that happened, was beside her without reservation. He also made very clear to the various interests, who occasionally tested whether the chief law officer of Sumner County could be influenced by his wife's activities, that he could not, and that attempting to influence him through her was going to produce results even less satisfactory than attempting to influence her directly. One October evening in 1882, almost exactly 8 years after a man who called himself Owen Doyle had pressed a gun to her neck on this porch, Beatrice stood at the paddock fence in the last amber light and watched her 2 children moving across the grass with a young horse between them. Young Hector, who was 6, was walking the horse on a lead with the particular focused attention he had inherited from both parents. Clara, who was 4 and who had already absorbed an impressive quantity of the basic mechanics of horse handling, was walking at the horse's shoulder with her hand flat and steady against its neck, talking to it in the same quiet, serious way that she had apparently arrived pre-equipped to talk to horses, which Beatrice found both deeply familiar and deeply moving. Owen came to stand beside her at the fence. He had come straight from the office, his coat still on, and he stood there for a moment watching his children before saying anything. "Hector has the lead angle right today," he said. "He worked on it all morning," Beatrice said. "He asked me 3 times about the angle, and I showed him twice, and the 3rd time he said he had it, and he did." Owen was quiet, watching his son and daughter move across the gold grass with the horse between them, and his face held that particular unguarded openness that Beatrice associated with the moments when he was most completely himself. "I have been thinking," he said, which was the way he began things that he had been actually thinking about for a while. "Tell me," she said, which was what she always said. "The breeding program," he said. "You have been talking about expanding the bloodlines to include some of the Spanish Mustang strains from the South. You would need to go to New Mexico territory for that." "I know," she said. "I have been thinking about the spring." "I would like to come with you," he said. She looked at him. He looked back at her. The children moved across the grass with the horse. "It is a long ride," she said. "I know," he said. 3 weeks minimum, possibly 4. "I know." "Your father would watch the children," he said. "He has been suggesting it every week since Clara was born, and I think he is genuinely excited about the idea of having them to himself for a month." She looked back at her children, her heart doing the thing it always did when she watched them, a warmth and a weight simultaneously, the specific feeling of loving something that is both absolutely yours and absolutely its own. "All right," she said. "The spring." He put his arm around her shoulders, which he did in the comfortable and easy way of people who have been touching each other for long enough that it requires no decision. She leaned into it, which was something she only did with him and only in specific circumstances: the porch at evening, the barn late at night, the kitchen in the early morning before the children were awake. "There is something else," he said. "Tell me," she said again. He was quiet for a moment. The children had stopped moving. Young Hector was looking back at the porch with the specific alertness of a child who has sensed that the adults are doing something interesting. Clara was not looking back. Clara had her forehead pressed to the horse's neck and her eyes closed, which was exactly what her mother had done at that age with horses, and which Owen had seen Beatrice do just recently with a new foal, and the recognition of that continuity made the evening feel like it held more than just the October light. "I am grateful," Owen said, "for all of it, this specific life, these specific choices." She understood what he meant. She understood it because she felt it too, the weight and the warmth of a life that was both hard and precisely right, built on something real and kept by consistent daily work and genuine love. "I know," she said. "I know you know," he said. "I still wanted to say it." She turned her head and looked at him in the evening light, at the scar on his jaw and the crooked right thumb and the honest, still eyes that she had read correctly from the first and never had reason to read differently. "Good," she said. And she kissed him on the porch in the October light with her children watching from the paddock, and young Hector made the universal sound of a 6-year-old confronted with parental affection, and Clara opened her eyes from the horse's neck and watched with the serene, assessing quality of a child who has learned observation from the best possible teacher. The grass was deep and sweet. The creek in the eastern quarter ran clear. The ranch that Hector Brenner Sr. had built with his hands and preserved with his stubbornness, and handed to his daughter with his whole heart, was alive and whole, and more than it had ever been. And somewhere in the horse barn, in the darkness of a stall that smelled of hay and lantern oil and the warm animal certainty of living things, a roan stallion who had started this whole story by getting himself stolen, turned in his sleep and settled, entirely content. The years that followed were good ones. Not without difficulty, because the Kansas Territory in the 1880s was not without difficulty for anyone trying to hold land and build something against the gathering pressures of industrial expansion and shifting policy. But the Brenner-Doyle operation had something that many operations lacked, which was a specific combination of documented legal groundwork, practical competence, genuine community connection, and a chief law officer whose integrity was not for purchase. The New Mexico trip happened in the spring of 1883, and it was everything Beatrice had hoped for and more. She found the bloodline she had been looking for in a remote operation outside Santa Fe, run by a family of Spanish-Comanche mixed heritage, who bred horses with the specific combination of endurance and temperament that she wanted to add to her program. Owen proved useful in the negotiations in ways that went beyond his working Spanish, though the Spanish was not negligible, involving an understanding of both the legal framework of the territory and the specific cultural protocols of the family that demonstrated a knowledge of the people of the Southwest that she had not fully accounted for. She also, on that trip, watched him handle a horse she had never seen before, an untried 4-year-old stallion with a history of aggressive behavior towards strangers, and do it with such complete ease and precision that the Santa Fe family's eldest son, who was an excellent horseman himself, stopped what he was doing and watched for a full 10 minutes before saying quietly in Spanish that the man had a genuine gift. Owen, hearing this, looked at Beatrice with a quality of transparent pleasure at the assessment that made her laugh, which was a sound she produced less frequently than most people, and therefore meant considerably more when it appeared. "He says I have a gift," Owen said. "I have been telling you that for years," Beatrice said. They came home with 3 horses and a breeding agreement and a pair of silver bridles that were impractical and beautiful, and the breeding program in the following year produced a line of horses that Beatrice had been building toward since she first understood what she was trying to build. In 1884, Hector Brenner Sr. died peacefully in his sleep in his own bed on the ranch he had built, which was as good a death as a man could ask for, and which he had been quietly preparing for in practical ways, ensuring all his papers were in order, for the past 2 years. He was 71 years old, and he had spent the last decade watching his daughter build something larger and more lasting than he had imagined when he first drove that stake into the Kansas ground. Beatrice grieved him with the same quality she brought to everything, deeply and without performance, and the grief had a completeness to it because the relationship had been complete. There was nothing left unsaid. He had known she loved him, and she had known he loved her, and the ranch they had both built was the physical record of everything that knowledge had produced. Owen held her through the worst nights without trying to fix it, which was the right thing to do, and he had learned it from paying attention to what she actually needed rather than what he imagined a person in grief needed. Young Hector, who was 8, understood that grandfather was gone with a gravity and a practical acceptance that spoke well of his character. Clara, who was 6, cried thoroughly and without self-consciousness, and then wanted to know if grandfather's rocking chair on the porch was now hers, which was so precisely the right question to ask that both her parents looked at each other over her head, with an expression that combined grief and love, and the specific absurd tenderness of raising a fully formed personality. The rocking chair became Clara's. In 1886, the last remaining thread of the railroad conspiracy case was finally resolved when the circuit court handed down a final judgment against the remaining corporate officers involved in the land seizure scheme. The judgment included a formal censure of the railroad's practices in Sumner County and a damage award that, while it could not restore the two families who had been pressured out, provided some partial acknowledgement of the harm done. Owen attended the final hearing as a witness and official representative of the county. Beatrice attended as herself, which was sufficient. On the way home from that hearing, driving the wagon through the October prairie with the same gold-dangled light that seemed to mark every important moment in their shared life, Owen said, "It is finished." "Mostly," she said, with the precision she always applied to such statements. "The two families are still gone." "That part does not finish." "No," he agreed, "but the account is as settled as the law can settle it." She nodded. It was enough to say yes, and it was not enough, and both of those things were true simultaneously. 12 years, she said, since you sat on a trail horse on a ridge in the rain and decided to come down, he said. She looked at him. "You saw me before I came down." "I did," he said. "I saw you assess the situation from the ridge for about 3 minutes before you made any move. I thought whoever that is someone who knows what they are doing." She had not known he had seen that. The detail was 12 years old and entirely new. "You never told me that," she said. "I am telling you now," he said. The wagon moved through the October grass, and the evening came down around them, clean and cold and full of stars, the specific stars of the Kansas prairie that she had known all her life and would know until she did not. And she put her hand in his and held it, and they drove home. The children were on the porch when they arrived, both of them. Hector with a book and Clara with a new horse halter she was braiding from scraps of leather in the specific pattern her mother had taught her. The lamp in the window was lit. The horses were quiet in the paddock. The land stretched away in every direction into the dark, the same land that had been fought for and kept and built into something that would last beyond any single life. Beatrice Brenner stepped down from the wagon and looked at all of it for a moment. The porch and the lamp and her children and the dark land and the stars above the dark land and the man beside her who had come through the night once when she needed him and stayed for the rest of it by choice. She had been a woman who did not need rescuing, and she had never been rescued. She had recognized the real man when no one else had, and the real man had recognized her in return, which was the better and truer story. She walked up to the porch and sat in the second rocking chair and accepted the cup of coffee that Hector brought her with the contained pride of a 10-year-old who has made coffee successfully. And Owen sat beside her, and Clara showed them both the progress on the halter without looking up from her work, and the Kansas night settled around the Brenner Doyle ranch like something that had always intended to be there. It was, by any honest measure, exactly enough.